I'm from Disabled Women Ireland. Disabled Women Ireland is a DPO. That's a disabled persons organisation. And what that means is that over 50% of the board are disabled people. And under the UN CRPD, which is the UN Convention for the Rights of People with Disabilities, which is a mouthful, the views and extra weight is given to the perspective of DPOs, or should be. It's not, but that's what it should be. All members of Disabled Women Ireland are actually disabled people. We don't have any non-disabled people on our board. And we're completely voluntary. We're a completely voluntary organisation. Okay. So I'm just going to run through this. I'm doing a really terrible thing where I have slides with loads of information on them. The thing you're told not to do when you're doing a presentation. But unfortunately, this is such a huge area and it doesn't really get a lot of attention. There's very little research or very poor research. Most of the research that we've had to use today has been international research. But one of the things that is shown is that internationally throughout the world, these figures hold true for every country that the research has been done. So there's no reason to believe that it'd be different in Ireland. So this is just some basic information about disabled people in Ireland. And then I'll go more specifically into the issues as relation to domestic abuse. So in Ireland, EU figures say that 19.9% of women identify as disabled. The intersectionality between membership of the LGBTQIA+ traveller and ethnic minority communities means that there are higher rates of disability within those communities. So it's important when we're talking about things to remember that people may be multiply marginalised and that disability doesn't exist in a vacuum. Ireland is officially the worst country in the EU to be disabled in terms of poverty, social exclusion and unemployment. It's not a statistic we should be very proud of, to be honest with you. Disabled people in Ireland are 3 times more likely to live in consistent poverty. Only 25.8% of disabled women in employment compared to 71% of the general population. Those that are in employment tend to be in underemployment, part-time employment, very precarious work. The disability allowance is means tested, and that means that a lot of people can't work because they're afraid of losing their allowances. The UK figures show that half of disabled pregnant people experience intimate partner violence when pregnant. Now that statistic is true for all women, that it can increase when people are pregnant. It's significantly more serious for disabled women. It's important to note that over 8,000 disabled people live in residential centres in Ireland. So there's a whole cohort of people that are subject to a different form of abuse. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay. So some key information around disabled people and intimate partner or domestic abuse. Disabled women are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience all gender-based violence than their non-disabled peers. That's up to 78%. So that's a huge statistic. They're more than 4 times likely to have experienced sexual abuse in the past year. Women with cognitive impairments are found to experience violence at a rate of 10.7 times higher than non-disabled women. Disabled people are more likely to suffer abuse, violence, and exploitation at the hands of a family member or co-resident than non-disabled people. And that's important in terms of legislation, which I will talk about later. They're more likely to experience violence from a caregiver than non-disabled peers. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. If you want to go on to the next slide. So disabled women are more likely to experience increase in domestic violence as they age, which shows a difference between non-disabled peers. Generally, non-disabled peers experience more abuse the younger they are, and as they age, the abuse lessens. For disabled people, that actually increases the more they age and the more, I suppose, vulnerable or dependent they become. disabled children are 3 to 7 times more likely to experience abuse, and 49% of disabled women who are talking about domestic abuse were abused as children as well. Disabled women and children are more likely to be murdered by their family members or caregivers. There's a day, it's a very difficult day, called the Disabled Day of Mourning, where those people are remembered. And it is shocking how often it happens, and it is shocking how little the legal system does about it. Through our research, we have found only one case where a caregiver murdered a child and actually got a sentence, and that was overturned on appeal. So it's an extremely worrying and terrifying statistic, and that, as I said, that's internationally as well. That's not just a thing that's specific to Ireland. There's evidence that disabled women are more at risk of being targeted for trafficking, especially those with a cognitive disability. Now, the reason that unfortunately, there's far more statistics that I could give you around this. The reason that I drew attention to this is these statistics are shocking. These statistics are huge. Yet, how many disabled people present at a refuge? How many disabled people present at services looking for refuge every year or even every month? And that's the thing that we need to think about. Disabled people are far more vulnerable. And when I say vulnerable, it's not an inherent characteristic of disability. Just because you're disabled does not inherently mean that you are vulnerable. But the way that the system is set up, the way the society is set up, the way economic factors and other factors play into it means that disabled people are being made vulnerable. So we need to look at why can't they access service? What are the barriers to them accessing service when the statistics are so high, when we know so many disabled people are at risk of violence? Why are so few presenting to services? The next slide. So here are a number of factors. I actually have about 3 pages more that I could have put up here. It's very difficult to narrow it down. So one of the major things is financial dependence. We all know about financial control and financial abuse. But disabled people, a lot of times their payments are tied, they're means tested to, if they have a partner, they're means tested. An awful lot of times things like carers allowance are paid to their caregiver, not paid to them. So an awful lot of disabled people can end up very financially dependent, especially if their partner is very controlling. A lack of independence regards to support or housing, not having a choice where you live, not having a choice who supports you. Disabled Women Ireland would argue and want the access to a statutory, access to personal assistance put on a statutory basis, which would mean that it's different from a home help or a caregiver that comes in. It means that the disabled person is given the money and they decide who their support is and who they hire the person, basically. There's an increased likelihood of institutionalization or residential leaving. This is a threat that is used against an awful lot of disabled women if they try to leave. Increased social isolation. Unfortunately, being disabled can mean that people are socially isolated anyway without any link to domestic abuse. But obviously, as we know, a lot of perpetrators will socially isolate their victim from their family and from their friends. This increases, the vulnerability to this increases if you're disabled. Stigma. There's a lot of stigma, especially around developmental conditions. Physical and informational barriers. So your service may not be accessible, or people might not know how to access the information. Don't know about your service, don't know how to find your service. A study done in England of women with cognitive and neurodevelopmental differences found that 100% of them had no idea how to contact their local refuge. So the lack of education, particularly sex education, this is an enormous problem for disabled people, especially people who have been disabled since childhood, that their doctors are reluctant to talk about them. There's a perception that disabled people are asexual beings that don't, like, why would they need to know about sex? They don't have sex. And the reluctance to talk to them about consent, about bodily autonomy and all this, which obviously leaves disabled people very vulnerable to abuse. A lack of training and support services specifically around disability. We would argue that there needs to be targeted training delivered by DPOs, or, at least partly delivered by DPOs. Fear of losing custody of children. This is a massive one. We in Disabled Women Ireland have had people talking to us about this, and it's not, unfortunately, it's not an out there suggestion. In 2018, an Australian study found that I think it was something like 49% of women that presented to a domestic abuse service for support lost the custody of their children. So if it comes down to a choice of losing your children or staying where you are, many disabled people will stay where they are, fortunately. Okay. So barriers to accessing refuge, I've kind of touched on these before. Inaccessible contact methods. And what we mean by that is, do you only have a helpline? What if somebody's non-speaking? What if somebody is deaf? What if, like, there was a recent study done with she's an Irish doctor, Dr. Mary Doherty, and, for example, autistic people really struggle to make phone calls. 70% of autistic people avoid. Now, this was done around healthcare, but we can extrapolate that the same difficulties would arise. 70% of autistic people don't ring the doctor because they don't like phone calls. That's how much they don't like phone calls. They won't get necessary healthcare. If you only have a helpline, or people can only access you through a website, are you sure that your website is accessible to people who are dyslexic, people who are dyscalculate, people, inaccessible to those, sorry. So the next part is inaccessible to those with physical disabilities. We've tried researching this. We could not find information on Ireland on actual refuges and how accessible they are. From personal experience, I know that the one I'm aware of is not accessible. Things like if you have a wheelchair bathroom, is it part of a room, or do people have to leave the room and go down a corridor just to use the bathroom? Do you have hoists? Do you have adult changing tables? And I know we have to have fire doors, and I understand that, but they're an accessibility difficulty for people. I know cases of people who have gone to refuges and had to leave because they just couldn't live their day-to-day life. Inaccessible access to information. There's a lot of forms involved in accessing refuge services. And I don't know about every service, but do you have them in easy to read? Do you have them in plain English? Do you have them in Braille? Are they accessible to a screen reader? Screen readers can't read PDFs, for example. And do you know the difference between an easy to read document and a plain English document, because they're not the same thing? So another thing that makes accessing refuge difficult, especially for those who are autistic or those who have CPTSD or anxiety, is a sensory environment. Refuges are noisy places. There's a helpline phone going all the time. There's families living very close together. Multiple children could be living in different rooms. There's people cooking. They're quite overwhelming. They're quite overwhelming environment to be in, and that can be a barrier to accessing refuge. Paperwork, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of paperwork, and that can be overwhelming. That can be very overwhelming for people, to the point where they're like, no, actually, this is too much hassle. Interviews and interventions, we have to do it. You have to do interviews when they arrived, and then they have to go and talk. They have to talk to so many different services, different people. There's a lot of expectation. And if you have executive functioning issues, if you have processing difficulties, if you have differences in communication, all of that can be insurmountable all at once when you are already in a stressful, very stressed state. As mentioned before, the people living in institutional or residential living facilities, if they're being abused in those residential living facilities or in those institutions, how do they access refuge when they don't have access, may not have access to their own phone or to their own communications? It might only be through a caregiver. And again, as I mentioned, the lack of specific training or knowledge of disability of staff. If you don't know what to look out for, basically you won't know what to look out for and what you need to do. So the next part, sorry. So in terms of the court system and the legal system, I don't know if Clarehaven runs a court accompaniment service, but there are specific difficulties with disabled people accessing the legal system. So many documents and records are inaccessible to those who use screen readers. Now, in fairness, the court system in Ireland are addressing that, and they are trying to convert a lot of documents to Word. Most Garda stations and courts are inaccessible or not fully accessible. Most of them were built at a time where it wasn't even a thought in people's heads. Access to documentation is at the discretion of the judge and may incur cost. Obviously, that's a difficulty, as we mentioned, how many disabled people are on low income or underemployed. This one is very important for me as a neurodivergent person, but also as a kind of hidden disability thing that people mightn't think about. Systematic ableist biases regarding competence or credibility. So what that means is there's an assumption that if you have an intellectual disability, if you have a cognitive difference, that your capacity is questioned when you go. So if you're a witness in your own case, if you're an autistic person, you may have a meltdown from the stress of being in the situation, the stress of all of it. That can be used against you and seen as a challenging behavior rather than a person under extreme stress. Another thing that happens that not very many people are aware of when it comes to autistic people is what's called shutdown. Shutdown is basically an internalized meltdown, but what it can mean is that a person, like as it says, a person can shut down. So they may be situationally non-speaking or mute. They may be incapable of speaking. They may be incapable of making eye contact. They may look guilty to an outside observer because they're not responding, or they're not responding to questions that are being asked because they can't. It's just so overwhelming that they actually can't. And again, that could be used against a client, especially if you have a perpetrator who knows that about the person and deliberately provokes that reaction in them. Courts for everybody are very stressful and adversarial, including, that goes into the neurodivergent people. So, and also an awful lot of people with anxiety, CPTSD, autistic people, ADHD people have different processing speeds. So they may not be able to, it may take them a while to figure out what's happened. Another thing that I haven't put here, but I should have, is around sign language interpretation. The sign language interpretation is extremely difficult to organise in Ireland. It's extremely difficult to resource because there are so few, and it's a much required service. But the difficulty is that you need somebody who's specifically trained in the legal system to be a sign language interpreter for the courts, and that's very, very hard to find. You don't want a case where somebody has a sign language interpreter, and because the interpreter doesn't have knowledge of the law, they don't know, like legalese is a different language basically. So that's really, really important that the person that is there interpreting, even if you have a sign language interpreter coming in to talk to a client when they're accessing refuge for the first time and everything, they need to understand, they need to be specifically trained in helping and supporting in the area of domestic abuse. And I'm not sure that even really exists, to be honest with you. We couldn't find any information on it, to be honest. So the next one. These are specific neurodivergency issues. And the reason that I'm highlighting these is that, you know, they're termed as hidden disabilities. And there is mounting evidence for the overrepresentation of people with neurodivergent issues within homeless and domestic abuse services. Mm-hmm. And yes, there is no specific training for staff in those conditions, I suppose would be the word. So oftentimes if somebody already has a diagnosis, if they're diagnosed as autistic, anxiety, depression, OCD, Tourette's, ADHD, a perpetrator will use that to control and gaslight a disabled person, but they will also use it for the people around. They will use I'm so good to put up with them, and look how hard I have and how difficult my life is for putting up with this person. And that can be used as a form of control. ADHD, I've mentioned specifically because it is overrepresented in the court system and in homeless figures. I couldn't find information specifically about domestic abuse, but there's no reason to believe. And the reason that might be very important for you is that ADHD is linked to risk-taking behavior. People with ADHD, I am one of them, do not process dopamine properly. And so our brains are constantly seeking dopamine, and dopamine is what you get from taking risks. So you may find a person who consistently and constantly keeps on making risks. You know, why do they keep on making these same mistakes? It could be that. Also, people with ADHD have executive functioning, different difficulties with executive functioning. So filling in forms, completing tasks, staying on tasks, task initiation. So you may have a client who you keep on having to remind them to do tasks and keep on doing tasks and everything. The reason I'm mentioning these is that it might help you feel less frustrated if you have this in your mind, that this person may actually have a difficulty with executive functioning, may actually have an actual difficulty with this. I'm trying to annoy you, to be honest. Capacity. You may have heard autism being referred to as a spectrum condition. What that means is that one day somebody might be able to do something. That doesn't mean that the next day they will have the same capacity to do it. Spectrum doesn't mean severe to low functioning. Absolutely, functioning labels are ableist and shouldn't be used. What it actually means is that on any given day, a person's sensory profile, their energy levels and everything can fluctuate quite significantly. So that's something to bear in mind, that if you have a client who's autistic, that just because they're able to do something one day may not mean that they're able to do it the next. Challenging behavior, I've put that in brackets because it's important to reframe that into your head as challenged behavior. A meltdown or a shutdown or falling or freezing, they are an anxiety response and should be more like equated with epilepsy. It's something that happens in a person's brain. They cannot control it. I've mentioned the difficulty about using the phone and attending meetings. Something like 63% of autistic people have an untreated mental illness, so that's important. I've mentioned misdiagnosis and underdiagnosis because it's extraordinarily difficult to get a diagnosis as an adult in Ireland. There is no pathway for referral for autism or for ADHD. So, and there's only a recent enough awareness that women could even be autistic or have ADHD. So you may have a lot of people presenting to your service that aren't diagnosed, or that have been misdiagnosed with things like borderline personality disorder, anxiety, depression. I'm not saying everybody who shows up who's depressed or has anxiety is necessarily autistic or ADHD, but it may be worth having it in the back of your mind that this person may actually be an undiagnosed neurodivergent person. Another thing about processing and communication differences, the autistic people communicate differently. We communicate differently to a neurotypical person, and that can lead to big difficulties with understanding each other. It's a two-way street. And there's been a lot of research into what are called thin slice judgments. So that's that kind of split second judgment that you make on a person. And what it's found is that neurotypical people will make a very quick snap decision about an autistic person, a negative judgment on, and like oftentimes the autistic person isn't even aware of what they've done or anything like that. But what it means is that we need to be aware of our biases. We need to be aware that that might be something that's there. I've spoken about executive functioning. That's the ability to plan and carry out tasks. Demand avoidance is also a sub-profile, I suppose, if you will, of autism. A lot of autistic people are what's called demand avoidant. So that's something that you need to be aware of. If you have a client who's really struggling or really just seems to shut down all your suggestions and stuff like that, they may be demand avoidant. So there may be ways you need to adjust your language so it doesn't sound like you're giving an order or you're making a demand. It's the change between declarative language and figurative language. I won't go into it too much. So the next slide. Yeah, so this is state failures in Ireland. This is kind of more outside the remit of an actual service, but I want to mention it because the definition of perpetrators is overly prescriptive in Section 39 of the Domestic Violence Act of 2018. Basically, it limits perpetrators to being intimate partners and family members, but it doesn't, it's too prescriptive in that it doesn't really mention caregivers in the same role. And we would want that to be expanded to include caregivers in line with the Istanbul Convention, which does specifically mention that. As I said, we found it very difficult to find information on disabled women's experience of domestic abuse in Ireland. So, and that's a failure at state level. They disaggregate data by impairments. We need to break down which impairments people have so we can find out and resource different subsets and find out if there are certain people who are more at risk of abuse. Failure to provide accessible service and information, and failure to adequately fund same. So it's, as I said, we can see from the statistics that there are an enormous amount of disabled women who are at risk of domestic abuse. Yet there's very little funding to upgrade services, to make them more accessible, to give, to deliver training around this. And that needs to come from a state level, not rather than individual refuges trying to fund it themselves. In terms of what we spoke about coercive control, financial control, the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act is currently going through the Dáil, and it needs to be implemented. It's been dragged out, but it needs to be implemented because it specifically talks about people's capacity and they need to listen to their voices and to allow disabled people to have that decision-making in their own, to make sure their voice is very much included. The optional protocol of the UNCRPD means that disabled people can take a case against the state if it has failed them to the UN. That's the reason probably why Ireland hasn't ratified it yet. So again, we said we need to ratify the sections of the Domestic Violence Act in line with the Istanbul Convention to make sure that it is covering instances of coercive control, whether by a family member, intimate partner, or caregiver. Okay, so the next one, please. Right, so our recommendations or further thoughts would be to engage with DPOs. As I said, that's a disabled persons organisation, and provide disability-specific training. So developed in partnership with DPOs and led by disabled people. There's a disability maxim: nothing about us without us. And that means basically we need to be included, because if you aren't disabled yourself, even if you're the most well-intentioned person, you are going to make mistakes because you're not going to know what you don't know. Recognise disabled people as equal rights holders and prioritise their will and preference, autonomy and right to privacy. And that right to privacy is very, very important, because an awful lot of disabled people who are dependent because of physical or cognitive disabilities on caregivers lose that right to privacy. Disabled people are often taught compliance since childhood, which obviously a lot of the therapies and a lot of the interventions that we use with children teach children to be compliant. And that obviously leaves them very, very vulnerable to grooming and to abuse as they grow. Ensure public information and campaigns are accessible and reach everyone. That by offering them in plain English, by offering them in easy to read language. There's a need to conduct accessibility audits and make this information available to disabled women so they know where they can go. So for example, I know there's people at the moment who are being moved to the Department of Justice. But for example, that is something that TUSLA should be carrying out, and TUSLA should make that information available on their websites so that women can find their information, that they know where they can go, that they don't turn up at your service and have to be turned away because you can't accommodate them. And the proactive outreach, what we're talking about there is the fact that 8,000 people live in residential cares. So how do we reach those people? How do we do outreach with those people and ensure that everybody who needs the information about domestic abuse and how to access the service is actually getting it? And in terms of when I spoke about the sensory environment, something that you can do is what's called a sensory audit of the building or service. And literally all that means is taking a spot and sitting quietly and seeing, what can you hear, what can you smell, what can you see? And you may be surprised to find, oh my goodness, this is quite noisy or smelly or whatever, and trying to do things to adjust it with the sensory environment in mind. Okay. So that's the end of my presentation. If anybody has any questions, I'd be welcome to take them.
That's brilliant, Gillian. Thank you so much. It was really informative, particularly the recommendations at the end. They have made my mind spinning.